What if the CEO of a major restaurant chain walked into one of his own stores and caught someone stealing right under his nose? But what he uncovered next, it shook the very foundation of the company he had built from the ground up. This isn't just a story about a bad manager. It's a story about fear, about silence, and about the price people pay just to keep a job. It started with a 10-minute lunch stop game and turned into a war against corruption that reached all the way to the top boardroom. Richard Hale wasn't there as a CEO that day. He wasn't in a suit. He didn't bring an assistant, just a dad taking his 10-year-old son Ethan out for burgers on a sunny Saturday in Houston. But something felt wrong. The moment they stepped into that familiar red and gold fast food joint, the energy was off. Employees didn't smile. They didn't make eye contact. A cashier's hands trembled. A server flinched when someone barked an order from the kitchen. Behind the smell of fries and grilled meat, there was something else in the air, fear. Richard had built this company from scratch. He knew what a good store looked like. He knew what a good team felt like. This wasn't it. And when he overheard one man say, "You think you matter here? I could replace you tomorrow," he knew instantly. He had just walked into something far worse than bad service. Someone was abusing his people, and that someone had no idea the man standing near the back hallway listening in silence was the founder of the entire company. This is the story of how one man went undercover to fight for those no one was fighting for, of a cashier too afraid to speak, of a manager who thought fear was the same thing as leadership, and of a system built to protect the wrong people. But most of all, it's the story of what happens when the right person decides they've seen enough. The sun was high over Houston that day, casting long shadows across the streets as the city pulsed with the usual weekend energy. Families strolled, office workers grabbed lunch, and construction crews lined up at nearby food trucks. Among them, a man stepped out of a modest sedan jeans, polo shirt, and sunglasses. Nothing flashy, no entourage, no one gave him a second glance, which is exactly what he wanted. Richard Hale, founder and CEO of Hale's Burgers, adjusted his shades and looked up at the red and gold sign of one of his own restaurants. He'd opened this location 8 years ago. It had done well, or so the reports said. But today, Richard wasn't here for a report. He was here for the truth. "Can I get extra fries this time, Ethan?" His 10-year-old son tugged at his sleeve. Richard chuckled, ruffling the boy's hair. "Let's see if they're any good first." To the outside world, this looked like a father-son lunch, but for Richard, it was something more. This was how he learned what was really happening inside his empire, not from spreadsheets, not from sanitized email reports, but from walking in quietly, watching, listening. And the moment they stepped inside, he felt it. The restaurant was busy, sure, tables full, orders coming in, burgers sizzling on the grill, the air thick with the familiar scent of grilled meat, fries, and cleaning solution from the morning prep. But it wasn't right. He'd been in hundreds of locations. He knew the rhythm of a well-run store, the playful banter between staff, the teamwork behind the line, the easy flow of movement. Here it was silent tension. Employees moved efficiently, but without joy. No laughter, no casual chatter, heads down, shoulders tight. His eyes scanned the room. At the fry station, a young man glanced nervously toward the back hallway every few seconds. A waitress flinched at a barked order from the kitchen, and at the register stood a young woman with tired eyes and a strained smile. Her name tag read Lisa. "Welcome to Hale's Burgers," she said as they stepped up to order. "What can I get for you today?" Her tone was polite, but Richard heard the tightness, saw the way her fingers hovered over the register keys a moment too long, as if one wrong move could cost her everything. He smiled kindly, keeping his tone casual. "Are the fries good today?" Lisa paused, then gave a quick, nervous nod. "Yes, sir." Not exactly enthusiastic. As she handed him the receipt, he noticed her eyes dart briefly toward the kitchen, and her shoulders drop just slightly the moment the transaction ended, as if bracing for something. Ethan grabbed a booth by the window, but Richard didn't sit. Not yet. He excused himself, saying he needed to wash his hands, but in truth, he wanted to go where the cameras didn't reach, where the smiles dropped, where the real story lived, in the employee hallway, in the break room, behind closed doors, because something was wrong here, and he was going to find out what. Richard walked past the restrooms with casual steps, but his senses were sharp-tuned like a wire ready to snap. He wasn't looking for a confrontation. He was looking for the cracks in the floor no one ever reported. The words spoken when people thought no one was listening. That's when he heard it. A voice, sharp, loud, and dripping with disdain, came from the break room just beyond the hall. "You think you matter here? Look at yourself. I could replace you by tomorrow." Richard froze. He knew that tone. It wasn't frustration. It wasn't a manager correcting a mistake. It was dominance. Entitlement. The kind of voice that belonged to someone who thought they were untouchable. He inched closer, staying just outside the break room door, pressing his back against the cool tile wall. "I don't care how long you've been here," the voice continued. "You either step up or step out." Silence followed. Not the comfortable kind, the kind that choked. And then a quieter voice answered, trembling, but trying to hold steady. I'm doing my best." Richard's stomach turned. He recognized that voice. "Lisa." The reply came like a whip. "Your best isn't enough. If you keep screwing up, I'll cut your shifts. Maybe then you'll finally learn." Another silence. Richard could practically see her shrinking in that moment, holding her hands together at her apron, willing herself not to cry. He knew that feeling. He'd lived that feeling back when he was just a dishwasher in a greasy kitchen, being chewed out for missing a spot on a plate. The voice in the break room stepped closer. "You understand?" "Huh," it mocked. "Then why does this keep happening? You want me to replace you at the register?" No response. Just silence. Not the silence of guilt. The silence of survival. Richard's jaw clenched. His hands curled into fists at his side. This wasn't just a bad moment. This was routine. This was power used like a weapon, and Lisa was the target. He backed away slowly, keeping his face unreadable. This wasn't the time to burst in, to expose himself. Not yet. Because if someone had the gall to talk to an employee like that out loud, what else were they doing behind closed doors? And who else in this place was too scared to speak? He headed back to the dining area. But now his eyes weren't just observing, they were hunting. He wasn't here for lunch anymore. He was here for the truth. Richard returned to his table where Ethan was already halfway through his fries, completely unaware of the storm brewing behind the counter. But Richard's appetite was gone. He didn't even unwrap his burger. His eyes were fixed on the front, on Lisa, on the man who had just humiliated her. Mark Dawson, a tall, broad-shouldered manager in his late 40s with a buzz cut and a smugness that didn't need words. He didn't smile. He didn't pitch in. He just stood there, arms crossed, eyes scanning, a predator pretending to manage. And every time he moved, Richard noticed something chilling. Employees flinched. They sped up, spoke less, looked away. Lisa tried to keep her cool, but her hands trembled ever so slightly as she handed receipts. Her voice wavered. Once, she dropped a tray and rushed to pick it up, whispering an apology before Mark could even open his mouth. Richard leaned back, his drink untouched, watching. Then it happened. Mark strolled casually behind the counter, his expression calm. He opened the cash register as if doing a quick check. But what Richard saw next made his stomach drop. Instead of simply counting, Mark reached in 2 fingers, swift and precise, and pulled out a few folded bills. He closed the drawer without logging anything. No receipt, no explanation, no witness. Just money, vanishing into his pocket like it was part of the routine. Richard's heart pounded. It was quick, subtle, but not subtle enough. This wasn't panic theft. This was practiced. Mark didn't even look guilty. He walked off toward the office like it was just another item on his to-do list. Richard narrowed his eyes. So this wasn't just about mistreating employees. This was about money, stolen, regularly, boldly. And if Mark was doing this in broad daylight, in front of staff, in front of customers, then either he thought no one would dare stop him, or someone higher up was letting him get away with it. Richard took a slow breath. His instincts kicked in, the instincts of a man who had seen numbers not add up before, who had fired employees for less, and who had always trusted his system to catch thieves. But this time, the system had failed. He couldn't blow his cover yet, not without evidence. Not if this rabbit hole went deeper. So he stayed seated. He would watch. He would wait. And when the time was right, he'd burn the whole rotten structure down. Richard stayed in that booth for the next half hour, not as a CEO, not as a customer, but as a man trying to read the pulse of a workplace gasping for air. And the signs were everywhere. Every time Mark reappeared from the office, the room shifted, laughter vanished, movements became sharper, faster. No one made eye contact, not with Mark, not even with each other. It was fear, systemic, conditioned, a culture of walking on eggshells. Richard's gaze scanned the team. The teen at the soda machine spilled a lid, and his hands shook as he scrambled to clean it up. A server nearly dropped a tray when Mark passed behind her. She flinched as if expecting to be yelled at. And then, near the back of the kitchen, Richard saw him. A middle-aged man moving with quiet efficiency, not fast, not rushed, just steady. calm. He flipped a burger, plated another, checked a fryer. There was no panic in his movements, just control. Richard stood and walked casually toward the counter. When the man turned, Richard caught a glimpse of the name tag Alex Carter. There was something different about him. Not arrogance, not rebellion, just a quiet resistance, like someone who had already decided he wouldn't let fear swallow him. "Food's looking good back there," Richard said casually. Alex glanced over, gave a short nod. "Thanks. We try." Richard smiled. "You've been here long?" Alex wiped his hands on a towel. "Long enough. Busy place." Richard added. Alex let out a dry chuckle. "Yeah. But it's not just the lunch rush that wears people down." There it was. Richard leaned in slightly. "What do you mean?" Alex glanced over his shoulder. Mark was out of sight. He lowered his voice. "I like my job," he said quietly. "But management, that's another story. Feels like we're just here to make someone else look good. Do the work. Keep quiet. Don't ask questions." Richard kept his face neutral. "Sounds rough." Alex shrugged. "People don't quit because of the work. They quit because of him." Richard knew exactly who him was. Alex nodded slowly. "He's got a way of making sure no one lasts if they don't fall in line. You push back, he'll cut your hours, write you up, make your life miserable until you walk out." Richard's jaw tightened slightly. So this wasn't just a bad boss, it was a strategy, a method of control. "And you?" Richard asked gently. Alex met his eyes, calm, honest. "I keep my head down, do my job. Doesn't mean I like it." That was all Richard needed to hear. He thanked him and walked back to his table, mind racing. Now he had two names, Lisa and Alex. Two witnesses. Two people surviving inside a system built to break them. And one manager growing bolder by the minute. The deeper Richard looked, the worse it got. This wasn't just about one abusive conversation or a few stolen bills. This was a pattern, a system. And Lisa, she wasn't just afraid. She was trapped. He watched her behind the counter, polite, efficient, always composed, but there was something heavy in her movements, like she was carrying more than just the weight of the shift. So when she stepped out from behind the register with a tray of supply lids headed toward the drink station, Richard made his move. He walked up casually, grabbed a napkin, and said just loud enough for her to hear, "Working here seems exhausting." Lisa didn't respond right away. She kept restocking, moving lids into place, adjusting the straw holder. Then finally, without looking at him, she replied, "Depends on who you ask." Her voice was neutral, carefully guarded. Richard nodded slowly, playing along. "Seems like it gets tense sometimes." Lisa let out a short breath. "It's a job." That phrase, "it's a job," a sentence people say when it's not okay, but they've learned to pretend it is. Richard waited a beat, then said quietly, "I've worked in places like this before. Had bosses like him too." He didn't say Mark's name. He didn't need to. Lisa's hands froze for a split second. Her eyes flicked toward his just briefly, then back down. "You already know how it works then," she said. He tilted his head. How what works? She hesitated, then gave a faint shrug. Some people get to do whatever they want. The rest of us just try to keep up. It wasn't a confession, but it was a door left slightly ajar, and Richard knew not to push it open too fast. "Sounds frustrating," he said. Lisa nodded slightly. Could be worse. But Richard saw it the way her hand gripped the counter a little tighter, the way she looked around before answering. She had more to say. She just wasn't ready yet. Not here, not out in the open. But she wanted someone to listen. Richard walked away slowly, heart heavy. She was the key. And if he was going to take down whatever was happening in this place, he needed her to trust him. Because it was clear now, Mark wasn't just a bad boss. He was running a machine, one that silenced, starved, and squeezed good people until they either broke or disappeared. That night, Richard sat alone in his car a few blocks from the restaurant. The streetlights flickered above as his laptop glowed in the dark cabin. He wasn't done, not even close. He had seen enough to trust his instincts, and now it was time to dig into the numbers. Years of running Hale's Burgers had given Richard executive-level access to the company's internal systems. He logged in, bypassing the usual dashboards, and headed straight for the raw back-end reports, the ones only upper management could see. And what he found confirmed everything. The Houston location was underperforming by 15 to 20% compared to other stores in the same region, despite having similar traffic and hours. But that was just the start. Inventory usage was steady beef, buns, condiments, nothing out of the ordinary. But sales, they didn't line up. Too much product moving, not enough money coming in. Someone was either giving away food or pocketing the revenue. Richard knew which. Then came the real red flags. Vague expense reports labeled things like operational adjustments or equipment rounding. No receipts, no explanations. Classic trick. Inflate costs to siphon money off the books. And one name appeared consistently on the approval trail, Mark Dawson. But Richard's gut told him this didn't start here. So he pulled up Mark's employment history. San Antonio, Dallas, now Houston. 3 different locations over 7 years. And at each one, reports of minor discrepancies. Managers suddenly dismissed, declining profits, until Mark arrived. And somehow, every time he was promoted, Richard's fingers hovered over the keyboard, his heart pounding. This wasn't just about Mark anymore. This was about whoever kept moving him from one store to the next, sweeping dirt under the rug, and pretending the stain didn't exist. He picked up his phone and scrolled to a contact he hadn't called in a long time, David Langley, Chief Financial Officer of Hale's Burgers, one of the few people Richard still trusted. He hit dial. David answered on the 3rd ring. "Richard, wow." "Been a while." Richard didn't waste time. "I need your eyes on something. Now." There was a pause. "Go on. I think one of our stores is bleeding cash, and I just watched the manager pull money from the till. No log, no receipt." David's tone shifted. "That's not just bad practice. That's theft." "Exactly," Richard said. "But I need more than a hunch. I want to know who's been signing off on those false expense reports, and who's overseeing payroll for this region." David didn't hesitate. Give me an hour." Richard hung up and sat back, staring at the glowing logo on the laptop screen. Hale's Burgers was his name, his legacy, and someone had been staining it for years behind closed doors, using scared employees and buried numbers to get rich. Not anymore. 1 hour later, Richard's phone buzzed. A message from David. "You need to see this. Check your email." Richard opened the laptop, refreshed the inbox, and there it was. A folder labeled Houston Internal Adjustments, 6 months. He clicked, and what he saw made his chest tighten. The cash thefts were only the tip of the iceberg. Revenue drops only happened on days Mark was managing, and not small dips, significant ones. And the missing money was never flagged because it had been carefully buried under fake expenses, equipment maintenance, employee meals, unscheduled supply costs. David had highlighted them all. Even worse, the payroll irregularities. Several employees, including Lisa, had clocked in full shifts, but were paid for fewer hours. Their schedules were altered after their shifts ended, meaning someone had access to the system and was deliberately shaving wages. But who? Richard's eyes scanned the authorization logs. The access came from a regional level. Someone above store management. Someone who had the power to approve financial changes without alerting corporate. David's voice came through the phone, calm but tight. "Richard, it's not just Mark." Richard leaned forward. "Then who?" A pause. Then David said the name like it tasted sour in his mouth. "Ronald Vickers." Richard's eyes narrowed. Ronald was the regional director of operations, oversaw multiple stores including Houston, the kind of executive who rarely showed up in person, but always signed off from behind the curtain. David continued. Ronald's name appears in the back-end logs for 3 of the locations Mark worked at. He was the one who approved Mark's transfers and the adjustments that followed. "And corporate never caught this?" Richard asked. "Some reports were filed." David said, "Whistleblower complaints, mostly, but none made it past his department." Richard sat back, stunned. Ronald hadn't just ignored the theft. He'd enabled it, protected it. Used Mark like a pawn, a loyal soldier who kept stores clean by pushing out anyone who asked questions. And somehow, every single report against them had been buried, which meant the corruption wasn't just deep. It was engineered. "Keep digging," Richard said, his voice low. "I want to know everything. Every location Ronald touched, every transfer, every missing dollar." David exhaled. "I'll get it to you." Richard hung up and stared at the screen, jaw clenched. Mark was just the mask. Ronald was the machine. And now, Richard was going to take it apart piece by rotten piece. The next day, Richard didn't come to observe, he came to end it. He walked into the Houston location not in disguise, not as a customer, but as the owner. The lunch rush was in full swing, customers chatting, fryers sizzling, orders being called. But the moment Richard clapped his hands loud, sharp, and deliberate, the room froze. "Everyone, I need you to gather around." Heads turned. Lisa looked up from the register, her eyes wide. Alex stepped back from the grill, eyebrows furrowed. The younger staff exchanged glances, confusion, curiosity, fear, and then Mark emerged from the hallway, smiling that same smug smile. "I didn't realize we were hosting a company meeting today," he said with a forced laugh. Richard didn't smile. "We are," he replied coldly. "And it concerns you." The tension in the room thickened instantly. Mark's jaw twitched. "I'm not sure what you're trying to do here, but I've got a store to manage. You've had months to manage." Richard cut him off. "And here's what you've done." He held up a stack of papers, printed reports, highlighted in red. "This is a financial audit of this location over the past 6 months. Thousands of dollars in missing revenue, payroll irregularities, false expense entries." Murmurs rippled through the staff. Lisa stepped closer, her hands clenched. Alex crossed his arms, expression hardening. Richard turned to the team. "Your hours have been cut, your paychecks shorted, and every time you tried to ask why, someone made sure you got no answers." He stepped toward Mark. "And the trail leads back to you." Mark laughed short, nervous. "You're joking. You think I'm stealing from my own store." Richard flipped a page. "February 14th. You're the only manager on duty. Sales drop 18%, but inventory remains unchanged." March 2nd. You personally authorize an equipment repair fee of $490. No invoice, no work order. April 6th. Lisa clocks in for an 8-hour shift. Payroll logs show she was paid for 5 gasps. One of the employees whispered, "That's why my paycheck was off." Mark's smirk faded. Richard stared him down. "You think no one's watching, that no one will speak up. But you were wrong." Silence. Then a voice cut through. Lisa, clear, steady. "That's why our checks kept coming up short." Then Alex. "That's why people kept quitting." Then another, and another. Mark's eyes darted around. The control he once held in this place evaporating. "You think this is how you run a business?" he spat. Richard's voice was calm, measured. "No, this is how you destroy one." And with one final breath, he said, "You're finished here." 3 days later, Richard walked into the boardroom at Hales Burger's corporate headquarters, and this time, he wasn't asking for permission. The room was sleek. Polished oak table, floor-to-ceiling windows with a skyline view, 12 board members, suits. Silence. At the head sat James Prescott, senior board member, a man who had once mentored Richard through his early years in expansion and now watched him with wary, calculating eyes. Richard dropped a thick folder onto the center of the table. "We have a problem," he began. "And it's bigger than just a rogue manager in Houston." He opened the file and began to speak clearly, methodically. Over the last 6 months, multiple stores under one regional director, Ronald Vickers, have shown repeated patterns of fraud. Missing revenue, inflated expenses, manipulated payroll. James raised an eyebrow. "Do you have evidence?" Richard nodded. "Plenty." He handed out printed reports. Marked in red were expense entries that never matched inventory use, dates where employees clocked full shifts but were paid for half, adjustments made after hours by someone with regional access. The fraud didn't start with Mark Dawson. It was protected by Ronald. A stir in the room. And here's where it gets worse. Richard continued, flipping to a final document. A bank transaction from Ronald's personal account, a 5-figure wire sent to one of us. He slid the paper toward James. James didn't even blink. That's quite the accusation. Richard met his gaze. You approved every internal restructure Ronald requested. You signed off on payroll policy changes. You buried every complaint before it reached this table. Now the room was no longer silent. It was buzzing. James smirked. I've made decisions in this company's best interest. No. Richard interrupted. You made decisions in your interest. You used Ronald to cut costs and protect your bonuses. And in doing so, you stole from the very people who make this company run. Suddenly, a chair scraped back. Sarah Anderson, co-founder and one of the longest-serving board members, stood. Her voice was steady. This company was built on fairness, on trust. If even half of what Richard is saying is true, we've failed. She looked around the room. I propose we launch an immediate internal investigation and suspend both Ronald and James pending full review. Another member nodded. Then another. James stood abruptly, color draining from his face. You can't be serious. You lost our trust, Sarah said, the moment you sold out our values. Richard didn't smile. He didn't need to. He had come for the truth, and now the truth had weight. James stormed out of the room, briefcase in hand. Ronald would be next, and for the first time, the boardroom belonged to the people who cared. The press conference wasn't held in some sterile boardroom. It was staged in the heart of the city, a rented community center packed wall to wall with reporters, flashing cameras, and an audience hungry for answers. The Hales Burgers scandal had already gone viral. Headlines swirled with conflicting narratives. Executive power grab whistleblowers, silenced CEO overreaches. And Ronald, he had moved first, leaked emails, planted stories, claimed Richard had unjustly fired a loyal manager, but today the truth would speak for itself. Richard stepped to the podium, not as a polished executive, but as a man who had seen too much and had finally had enough. For too long, he began, voice steady. Our company has allowed silence to protect power. Today, that ends. He stepped aside and motioned for Lisa. She walked to the microphone. No suit, no PR script, just a uniform and a voice that had been silenced too long. My name is Lisa, she said, and I worked under Mark Dawson. I was threatened. I had my hours cut. My paychecks never added up, and every time I asked why, I was told I should be grateful to have a job. The room was dead quiet, but we're not just workers, we're people, and we deserve better. Next came Alex, calm, grounded. He spoke of watching employees quit, watching Mark skim cash, watching fear become part of the daily routine. Then Daniel, a former assistant manager pushed out for reporting theft. And finally, Cassandra, a corporate accountant who once flagged irregularities. Every time she did, she was told she miscalculated. Eventually, she was reassigned and then let go. Each testimony hit harder than the last. Together, they didn't just tell a story, they exposed a system, one built on fear, maintained by silence, and protected by men who thought they'd never be caught. Richard stepped forward once more. This isn't about one bad manager or one corrupt executive. This is about accountability. And this time, the cameras didn't turn away. By sunset, headlines had flipped "Whistleblowers Speak Out." Hale's Burgers admits systemic failures. CEO Richard Hale commits to company overhaul. Online, support flooded in. Customers vowed to keep buying because now they knew someone inside was fighting for what's right. And inside the company, something shifted. For the first time in a long time, the people who made the burgers felt like they mattered. The boardroom was quiet when the vote came in. Ronald Vickers terminated, James Prescott removed from his post, pending legal review. The rot at the top had been cut out, but Richard knew the damage ran deeper than any one name. The real failure wasn't just fraud, it was neglect. A culture that punished truth and rewarded silence. That had to change. So when the room turned to him when the board asked what now, he didn't hand over another policy memo. He brought a blueprint. "We don't need a PR fix," Richard told them. "We need a rebuild from the ground up." And he meant every word. In the weeks that followed, Richard launched the most aggressive restructuring campaign in the company's history. An anonymous employee feedback system was rolled out company-wide, allowing team members to report mistreatment, theft, or discrimination without fear of retaliation. Leadership retraining was made mandatory. Every manager from assistant to regional would now undergo ethics and emotional intelligence courses, with evaluations based on peer and employee input. A new whistleblower protection policy was codified into the employee handbook, signed and endorsed by the entire board, making it illegal for any supervisor to punish someone for speaking the truth. And perhaps most radical of all, Richard restructured performance bonuses. Now, store managers wouldn't just be rewarded for profit margins, they'd be held accountable for employee retention, satisfaction scores, and internal culture metrics. Because Richard had seen the truth firsthand, happy employees don't just work harder, they protect the brand. This wasn't just about protecting Lisa, Alex, or anyone else who had suffered in silence. This was about building a company that would never allow someone like Mark to rise again, no matter how quiet the theft, no matter how smooth the excuses. As Sarah Anderson, the board's co-founder, said in their next meeting, "This should have been how we led all along." Richard nodded. He wasn't rebuilding Hale's Burgers to be more profitable. He was rebuilding it to be more human. 3 months had passed, and everything had changed. The Houston location, once stiff, cold, and silent, now buzzed with life. Laughter echoed from the kitchen. Employees greeted customers like they mattered. The smell of fries and burgers still filled the air. But this time, it wasn't covering fear. Richard pulled into the lot with his son Ethan in the passenger seat, kicking his feet and sipping a juice box. "Last time we came here," Ethan said, "you were on a secret mission." Richard chuckled. "Today we're just here for lunch." But it wasn't just lunch. It was a return, a reminder that the hardest changes start in the smallest places. As they stepped through the door, Richard felt it instantly, the difference. The tension was gone. The forced smiles replaced with real ones. Staff moved freely, confidently, like they weren't just surviving their shift, they were owning it. And then he saw her, Lisa, behind the register, shoulders back, hair pulled neatly, her smile full, unapologetic, and entirely real. She spotted Richard and grinned. "Well, well," she said, leaning forward. "Look who finally came in just to eat. Had to see if the fries are actually better now," he teased. She winked. They're better because the people making them aren't scared anymore. Further back, Alex stood over a group of new hires, laughing as he showed them how to handle the grill, flipping patties with an ease that came from purpose, not pressure. This wasn't just a turnaround, it was redemption. Lisa leaned in slightly, her voice softer now. "You should know, a few of those new hires, they applied because of what you did. They saw what happened. And they wanted to work somewhere that actually gives a damn." Richard blinked, caught off guard by the lump in his throat. "It wasn't just me," he said quietly. "You were the first one brave enough to speak." She smiled. "You were the first one who listened." After ordering, Richard and Ethan sat by the window, same booth as before. But now, everything was different. This time, Lisa wasn't bracing herself. This time, Alex wasn't keeping his head down. And this time, Richard wasn't undercover. He was exactly where he was supposed to be, watching a company become what it was always meant to be. Not perfect, but honest, and worth believing in. Richard sat back, his gaze drifting toward the glass windows at the front of the restaurant. The Hales Burgers logo, once just a brand, now meant something else. Not just food, not just business, but accountability and the willingness to ask, "Are we who we say we are?" He looked around at the young server confidently training a new hire, at the mother with her child in the corner, both laughing over milkshakes, at Lisa, now assistant manager, calmly handling the lunch rush like a leader born for it, at Alex, cracking jokes with the grill team. None of them had changed overnight. They had changed because someone finally believed they mattered. Because someone stood up when it was easier to stay quiet. Because one voice said, "This isn't right." And another voice answered, "I'll stand with you." And maybe that's how change always begins. Not with grand speeches, not with viral hashtags, but with one person who chooses not to look away. As Richard and Ethan finished their meal, his son looked up and asked Dad, "Was it scary, going undercover?" Richard smiled. "Yeah, a little, but not as scary as letting the wrong people stay in charge." They stood and walked to the door. Richard glanced back one last time. Same tables, same floor, same burgers, but a completely different spirit, because the soul of a company isn't in its marketing, it's in how it treats the people no one's watching. And sometimes, the greatest power a leader has isn't the power to give orders, it's the courage to listen. "Will you speak up, or will you walk away? Because stories like this don't just happen in boardrooms. They happen every day in break rooms, behind counters, and in people's hearts. And maybe, just maybe, this story is what they've been waiting for.